Over the winter of 1995-96, it seemed like the ugly, complex Bosnian War was finally coming to an end, as in late November, an agreement was reached at Wright-Patterson Air Base in Dayton, Ohio. 3 weeks after the leaders of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, and the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, Alija Izetbegovic, Franjo Tudjman, and Slobodan Milosevic, respectively, had been effectively locked in a room and told to sort it out, a new map of Bosnia-Herzegovina had been produced. The country would be heavily decentralized, effectively divided into two separate entities, the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina and the Republika Srpska, with layers of local government along ethnic lines, all overseen by the UN High Representative for Bosnia and Herzegovina, who had such sweeping powers that he was described as a viceroy. The first incumbent was Carl Bildt, whose term as Swedish Prime Minister had recently ended. UN peacekeepers would enforce the new agreement until the Security Council and High Representative agreed that they were no longer needed. The peace was still fragile, though, as the Republika Srpska in particular was not fond of the UN, which it saw as having taken the Bosniak side during the war, and which was continuing to pursue various Bosnian Serb commanders for war crimes. In early December, the Food and Drug Administration approved saquinavir, the first antiretroviral drug to be approved for preventing HIV/AIDS, 14 years after the first cases had been reported and 6 years after the drug had been patented. Early in the new year, there was renewed fighting between the Russian army and Chechen rebel fighters in the breakaway Caucasus Republic, and there was a flurry of changes at the top of nations around the world, not all of them planned. Ryutaro Hashimoto and Jorge Sampaio were elected as Prime Minister of Japan and President of Portugal, respectively. Andreas Papandreou resigned for health reasons and was replaced by Kostas Simic as Prime Minister of Greece. Polish PM Józef Oleksy resigned after accusations of spying for Moscow and was replaced by Włodzimierz Cimoszewicz. Sorry, Poland. Italian PM Lamberto Dini's fragile coalition fell apart and new elections were called for May, and there were coups in Sierra Leone and Niger. But in Haiti, the first peaceful handover of power in the nation's 192-year history saw René Préval take over from Jean-Bertrand Aristide, who'd been the first elected president before being ousted in a coup and then reinstated. And just a week before the Australian Grand Prix, that country's federal elections saw the incumbent Labour Party, headed by Paul Keating, who'd taken over from Bob Hawke in 1991, defeated by the Liberal National Coalition, led by John Howard, who'd only been leader for a couple of months following a decade of party infighting. Despite that, it seemed voters were tired of the Labour Party after 13 years and 5 terms, and the LNC were able to campaign on Keating's handling of the recession, as well as promising a referendum on Australia becoming a republic. As the Formula One teams prepared themselves for their return to Australia, there was plenty to discuss, but there were fewer sweeping technical changes like those between 1994 and 95 after the tragedies of Imola. Mika Häkkinen's accident in Adelaide underlined the need for better head protection for drivers, and the rules required that the cockpit sides be raised to mid-helmet height with a wraparound foam head restraint. Ironically, Häkkinen had been testing such a device between races before his accident. The cockpit opening was made larger to aid in extracting drivers quickly. The minimum weight was tweaked up by 5 kilos. Car noses weren't allowed to have points like the McLaren MP410, but would have to have a flatter or blunter section. And the front wing end plates were thickened again in another attempt to stop them cutting into tyres if they made contact. Meanwhile, continued development in circuit layouts had reduced the number of corners officially classified as high risk down to 2, though, frustratingly, I can't seem to find anything specifying which those were. There were, however, more dramatic changes in the sporting regulations, particularly around qualifying. Firstly, a single qualifying session held the day before the race would determine grid positions, rather than drivers taking their best time across 2 sessions on separate days. Secondly, with fewer cars competing than the nominal 26 grid slots, a driver would have to set a time within 107% of the pole position time in order to qualify. And in a change to the starting procedure, instead of the red light, green light start, now 5 red lights would go on in turn, and then all switch off at once to start the race. In addition, Mercedes-Benz now undertook to provide all the safety and medical cars, ensuring they would definitely be suitable rather than letting circuits provide their own. The increase in costs of Formula One meant that the grid had been shrinking rapidly of late. 28 cars originally entered 1995, but Larousse never made it to the start of the season, 26. Then Simtech folded during the season, making it 24. Over the winter of 95-96, Keith Wiggins decided that Pacific could no longer afford to maintain an F1 team and dropped down to F3000. And in the process, the venerable Lotus name officially disappeared from F1, though nobody had really credited Pacific Team Lotus as successors anyway. The French Dams team had been all ready to make the step up, but after looking at the finances they've also decided to stay in the lower category, so there are just 22 cars entering 1996 and a real possibility that that'll drop further, with Forti, Arrows, Tyrrell and Minardi all facing uncertain futures. Bernie Eccleston is publicly sanguine about the prospect of a 14-car grid, believing that these little teams are harming the glamorous elite image of F1 he wants to project, but there are new teams in the offing still. In January it was announced that Sir Jackie Stewart and his son Paul had signed a deal with Ford to enter a factory-supported team from 1997, and Paul had withdrawn his F3000 team to focus on the development. The Japanese Dome team had announced in late 1995 that they were thinking about a 1997 entry, which generated a lot of local interest. The calendar was very broadly the same as it had been last year, but after the commercial flop of the Pacific Grand Prix at Aida, it had been originally intended to move the race to Indonesia, before that idea was abandoned along with the race. The European Grand Prix at the Nürburgring was moved to open the European season in April in the hope of better weather than the rain-lashed 1995 race, and with the Australian Grand Prix moving to Melbourne and opening the season, the final race of the 16 would be the Japanese Grand Prix at Suzuka in mid-October. And there was a complete overhaul of the car numbering system, the first since 1974. At the start of that season, the numbers had been allocated based on where teams had finished in the Constructors' Championship the previous year, and ever since it had simply been a case of the defending Drivers' Champion and his team taking 1 and 2, swapping as necessary, and occasionally shuffling things round on an ad hoc basis, which was why Tyrrell had been sporting numbers 3 and 4 ever since, never having had a defending champion to require them to swap. But from 1996 onwards, all numbers, and the garage positions in the pit lane, would be allocated on the base of the previous year's constructors' table. In the case of 1996, Michael Schumacher's move to Ferrari meant the red cars would take numbers 1 and 2, Constructors' champions Benetton therefore slots 3 and 4, which meant that, as it happened, Williams and McLaren kept 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 respectively. So, let's look at the teams as we prepare for what's shaping up to be a really interesting season of F1. As usual, the version without the new sound effects is linked in the description. Ferrari. The prancing horse bears number 1 for the first time since 1990, when Alain Prost brought it with him from McLaren. Now Michael Schumacher has brought it with him from Benetton. What Tifosi and team alike want more than anything else is for Ferrari to bear that prestigious number because a Ferrari driver won the title. That hasn't happened since Jody Scheckter in 1979, and it's the job of Jean Todt to make it a reality. He's been remaking the team as he wants it for the last couple of years, with the deep pockets of Marlboro behind him. There's a new car, John Barnard's F310, not the prettiest Ferrari ever made, but nobody will care if it's quick. And in the back, the Scuderia have finally abandoned their love affair with big V12s and fitted Osamu Goto and Paolo Martinelli's new Type 046 V10, reported to be delivering 760 horsepower at 14,500 RPM. But power has never been the problem at Ferrari, it's been chassis handling and reliability. Schumacher has been hitting the Fiorano test track hard, working to understand the car and connect with his team, but all this is a big gamble for both him and Ferrari. If the rumours are true, Schumi is now being paid more than the rest of the field put together, and that kind of investment tends to make the investors impatient to see results. Todd says he's aiming for 2 or 3 wins in 1996, which would be an improvement on the last few years, but people have come to expect miracles from the young German. There were strong rumours that Nicola Lorini would finally get the nod as full-time race driver, but, allegedly, Schumacher was worried that an Italian teammate would mean split loyalties within the team, and instead approved Eddie Irvine, who he was sure would be a dutiful number 2, and Lorini will continue as test driver. Car number 1, Michael Schumacher. Some have called it arrogance on the part of the youngest double champion in history to feel that he can bestow his genius on the struggling giant of Ferrari and single-handedly guide the team back to greatness. That's probably a bit unfair. One man's confidence is another man's arrogance, after all, but if any one driver can manage it, it's Schumacher. But whether it's the sporting challenge, a falling out with Benetton, or just the lure of cold hard cash, he's certainly got a job of work ahead of him. He's making all the right cautiously optimistic noises, while professing his love for Ferrari, and Jean Todt has reshaped the team around him. Whatever he says in public, though, he'll regard anything less than the promised 2 or 3 wins as a failure, and must secretly be hoping he can put together an unlikely title tilt this year, especially if the highly fancied Williams duo spend the year taking points off each other. Car number 2, Eddie Irvine. Speaking of gambles, this signing came right out of left field for most people, and many suspect the hand of Bernie Ecclestone, who took over the management of Irvine, along with Mika Salo and Martin Brundle, temporarily after their manager Mike Greasley suffered a stroke after the Italian Grand Prix. In any case, Eddie's expected to be a Berger to Schumacher's Senna, a light-hearted foil to the German's intensity, and he at least seems to be upfront about that. Even if I could beat him, I can't, if you know what I mean, and nobody expects much from me, so there's no pressure, 2 of his quotes. But of course, it's Ferrari. Of course there will be pressure if he doesn't produce results. Maybe nobody's expecting him to win, but that's not quite the same thing. Like Ivan Capelli before him, he may find the move from the fun and crack of Jordan to the politicking and relentless media scrutiny of Ferrari a bit of a shock to the system. Benetton Renault. Perhaps as a means of thumbing his nose at Ferrari, Flavio Briatore has entered the Benetton team under an Italian licence this year and launched the new car, Ross Brawn and Rory Byrne's B196, at the Roman Amphitheatre at Taormina on Sicily. The message seemed clear. Everyone in Italy is talking about Schumacher and Ferrari, but we, not they, are Italy's top team now, though they remain based at Enston. The car is a development of the successful cars of the last 2 years, with the latest evolution of the all-conquering Renault V10 in the back, and an innovative 7-speed longitudinal gearbox. It's going to be a tough act to beat, and in the cockpit, again perhaps hoping to siphon off some support from Ferrari, are Jean Alesi and Gerhard Berger, now entering the 4th year of the partnership they forged at Maranello. Not always the most harmonious, but both won races in red, and the team will hope that they can bring that with them. To boost their Italian credentials, Benetton have announced F3000 champion Vincenzo Sosbury as their official test driver after he'd done some testing for sister team Ligier earlier in the winter. Car number 3, Jean Alesi. It's almost an article of faith among F1 fans that Jean Alesi should have won more than one race. Certainly he was very unlucky in moving to Ferrari just as they entered a tailspin in form, and everyone was pleased to see him win in Canada, and he should have won elsewhere too last year, but there remain questions over his temperament. Like Jacques Villeneuve, with whom he's often compared, he's spectacular to watch, but often at the cost of making mistakes and driving with his heart instead of his head, and he's generally held not to have the technical understanding of a Schumacher or a Berger. After 5 years at Maranello, his move to Benetton will be a difficult transition for him, but if it all works out he should win races and must be regarded as a title shout. Car number 4, Gerhard Berger. At 37, the Austrian's long career has almost come full circle as he returns to the team for whom he scored both his and their first win 10 years ago. Benetton to Ferrari to McLaren, then back to Ferrari, now back to Benetton, though the team barely resembles the one he left in 1986, with only a few old hands like Rory Byrne and Pat Symonds still hanging on. Like Alesi, he's never quite fulfilled the promise he seemed to have earlier in his career, and at this stage it's unlikely he will, but he still has the ability and his famous good humour, and 1995 showed that he is still fiercely competitive and has the will and racing instincts to win. Plus, the new cockpit regulations mean that for about the first time in his career, the lanky Gerhard will have an office that he genuinely feels comfortable in. Williams Renault. In 1995, Williams had the best car, certainly by the end of the season, only to lose both titles through a combination of bad strategy calls and silly driver mistakes. Frank Williams and Patrick Head aren't used to losing, and Adrian Newey's new FW18 will be the car they are hoping will get them back on top where they belong. It's well balanced, aerodynamically slippy like all Newey's cars, and in winter testing it's been setting some seriously impressive times, with Hill reportedly putting in some 9,000 kilometres of testing and new teammate Jacques Villeneuve not far behind, and the Canadian's been setting some scorching times too. The whole team, with the exception of the young Canadian, are smarting at their defeat in 1995 and will be keen to make amends this year. The combination of the great names of Hill and Villeneuve is a marketer's dream, of course, but Williams has had warring teammates before and it seldom goes well. Jules Bouillon, meanwhile, returns to his test driver role after his difficult stint on loan at Sauber last year. Car number 5, Damon Hill. After his highly public failures in 1995, Hill's season to come could go one of two ways. Either he'll be fired up and determined to do it right this time and 1996 is his championship year, or his morale is fatally held below the waterline, he's lost the confidence of the team, and the arrival of an ambitious young teammate will finish the job. The British press can be merciless, and he was widely reported as being the man that lost Williams the title, with rumours of his replacement even before the end of the season. Runner-up in 1994 and 95, can Damon take the final step in 1996 and become the first son of an F1 champion to take the title himself, or will he prove the doubters right? Car number 6, Jacques Villeneuve. Born in 1971 while father Gilles was still touring Canada driving Formula Atlantic and snowmobiles, Villeneuve Jr. was named after his uncle Jacques Joseph, a successful racing driver himself, though he never made much of an impact in Formula One. When young Jacques was 7, the family moved to Monaco as Dad signed for Ferrari, and he was signed up for a private Swiss college. Like his new teammate Damon Hill, he grew up knowing Formula One drivers as just Dad's friends. In his case, he got into all kinds of high adrenaline sports: base jumping, motocross, water skiing and, naturally for a Canadian, ice hockey. He was interested in racing too, but when he was 11 his dad died in qualifying for the 1982 Belgian Grand Prix. For a couple of years, Jacques understandably lost interest, but in 1984 he asked his mother if he could take up racing. She would have preferred him to go into the engineering or design side, but agreed if he improved his maths scores. He did, and began karting in Italy. Immediately impressive, he was tested in a Formula 4 car at just 13, and was enrolled in the Jim Russell School by his uncle back in Canada, and his schooling kind of fell by the wayside as he progressed as a driver. Neither the Canadian nor Italian authorities would grant the 16-year-old a racing licence, but Andorra would, so he signed up under the Principality's flag for a year until he was old enough, and then signed for the Prema team in Italian Formula 3, sponsored by the Camel cigarette brand. It proved a big leap for the 17-year-old, and he had to combine competitive racing with more time at racing school. He scored his first F3 points in 1990 and was considered a favourite for the 1991 title, but a mid-season chassis change rather put paid to that. He'd also fallen out with his manager and switched to racing promoter Craig Pollock in 1991. Lacking the funding to follow Prema into F3000, Villeneuve instead moved to Japan on advice from Patrick Tambay. He did well in a Works Toms, finishing second overall, and as many drivers do when money is tight, he took odd drives in all sorts of different formulae: Japanese touring cars and endurance racing, the Macau Grand Prix and Formula Atlantic back home in Canada. That was where he ended up for a while, signing up with Barry Green's team with support from Players Limited to enter the 1993 Atlantic Championship, then progressed into karts with the Forsyth Green team. Second at that year's Indy 500 turned heads, and although it took him until round 14 to win, he finished the season 6th overall and with the Rookie of the Year award under his arm. His memorable win at the 1995 Indy 500 cemented him as a star of the year, and the F1 teams were taking notice. Bernie Ecclestone, meanwhile, saw one of his primary jobs as fighting off the ever-growing popularity of IndyCar and was keen to not only poach its upcoming star, but also keep Canada and its Grand Prix in the F1 fold. Between Bernie, Pollock and Frank Williams, and a dollop of Rothman's cash, a deal was done and Villeneuve was Europe-bound. Perhaps aware of the failure of Michael Andretti a few years earlier, Jacques immediately knuckled down to testing, putting in lots of miles and some great lap times to ensure he would be fully ready for the new challenge. McLaren-Mercedes. The great hopes of McLaren for their new partnership with Mercedes in 1995 were quickly dashed, the Nigel Mansell farce early on just adding to the sense that the team had completely lost its way, as neither Nigel, Mika Hakkinen nor Mark Blundell could get much out of the evil-handling and unreliable MP410. Eventually, though, the car improved enough that it was at least able to score a couple of second places in the hands of the Finn and a series of lower points finishes for Blundell, and the team finished the season a distant fourth, but at least ahead of Jordan and Ligier, which had looked unlikely at times. All changed then for 1996, with the new MP411 with a longer wheelbase and a more traditional look than that experimental mid-wing of last year's car. A new Mercedes Ilmord V10 is in the back, and the talented David Coulthard has been brought in to drive. Mika Häkkinen's near-fatal accident in Australia saw the team draft Alain Prost in to do some testing. He'd only been expected to provide technical input and consultation, and there remain questions over whether Mika will be ready to compete in March. And with an eye on Carl Wendlinger last year, Ron Dennis must have half an eye on possible replacements if need be. Jan Magnussen continues as test driver and deputised ably enough last year, so maybe that's an option. In any case, Marlboro have spent a lot of money on Michael Schumacher's move to Ferrari and will be looking closely to see if their long association with McLaren is still value for money for them. Car number 7, Mika Häkkinen. It's still difficult to know exactly how good Mika Häkkinen is. Like Alesi, he has a reputation for being fast but erratic, causing too many accidents, but also for never having had the right equipment to show what he's capable of. He was easily better than any of his teammates last year, but given how unsettled things were in the second car, it's hardly surprising. Similarly, he demolished Brundle 15-0 in qualifying in 1994, but then Martin was never a strong qualifier. He's definitely got potential, not for nothing is he Ron's golden boy, but that was a really, really bad accident he had at Adelaide. His recovery and rehabilitation have been astonishing. At Paul Ricard in January, he was lapping just as quick as Schumacher a mere 2 months after his accident. Ron stayed away from that test to keep the pressure off, but Tyler Alexander and Mika's race engineer Steve Hallam were asked to report on his psychological state and were happy to say he was smiling and enjoying it. But of course, the acid test will come in race conditions. Car number 8, David Coulthard. So thoroughly has David Coulthard established himself as a top Grand Prix driver that it's difficult to remember that last year was his first full season of Formula One, having been handed the biggest pair of racing shoes to fill imaginable in 1994. He was immediately impressive alongside Hill, as Williams recovered from the loss of Ayrton Senna, and while he was never entirely on the same level in 1995, and will be keen to put a few daft errors behind him, he was good value for his debut win, and might have had more with a little luck. Such was his meteoric rise that he was rumoured to be headed to Ferrari, McLaren and Benetton, as well as staying on with Williams instead of Hill. Just like at Williams, he comes into McLaren as the upstart teammate to the established star, if under slightly less traumatic circumstances, and will be keen to quickly make it known he's not there as a number 2. Ligier Mugen Honda. 1995 was a decent, if not spectacular, season for Ligier, with a podium finish apiece for Brundle and Panis doing much of the heavy lifting points-wise. The relatively good results mollified a lot of the French journalists who were critical of the Benetton connection and worried that the Gallic nature of the team was being undermined, but over the off-season all those fears seem to have come true. With a budget cut in half, François Mitterrand no longer in a position to direct French state support their way, Briatore and Walkinshaw closed down the test team, laid off 40 employees, moved R&D to Tom Walkinshaw's facility in England, and hired Pedro Diniz to partner Panis. Even the livery looks less French, between the lighter blue with Gauloise replacing Gitane as Sater's brand of choice, with the white panels for Parmalat and the red and silver of Powerhorse, another Austrian energy drink that's absolutely not trying to look like Red Bull. The whole effect is a distinctly lower grid-looking patchwork applied to a chassis which is essentially an updated version of last year's car. The ownership and management structure of the team remains murky too. On paper, Flavio runs Benetton and Tom runs Ligier, and the two are completely separate. But nobody really believes that, and it doesn't help that Briatore was at the team's launch in January as team boss, while the car continues to look a bit too much like the Benetton for everyone's comfort. Flavio, Tom and co have all said that 1996 is going to be a tough year, while better things are lined up for the future, and Ligier have certainly been there before. Car number 9, Olivier Panis. Another one in the we don't really know how good he is pile. Panis beat his more experienced teammate Eric Bernard in his debut year in 1994, but had a disappointing 95. Before his unexpected and rather fortunate second place at Adelaide, he had managed a few lower points finishes, but never looked quite as confident in the car as Martin Brundle, though he had comfortably demolished Suzuki at least. On the basis of last year, his new teammate Pedro Diniz should be more of a Ligier than a Martin, and certainly Panis will be expected to carry the team on his shoulders, though his first job will be to convince his own boss. Briatore said at the car's launch that Olivier was still on board, primarily because the French sponsors wanted him there, and he still had to prove that he was number one material. Walkinshaw's views are unknown, so a lot will depend on who's actually in charge. Car number 10, Pedro Diniz. Everyone knows that there is only one reason Diniz is driving for Ligier, and it's written on the side of the car, Parmalat. But that said, he actually acquitted himself as well in the Forti last year as anyone could have, pretty much even with Roberto Moreno on qualifying, and finished 10 out of the 17 races. That's about as much as you can do at that end of the grid, so it's always possible he's actually not bad behind the wheel. While undoubtedly he won't be getting as much support as Panis, who will get the newest and best equipment, he'll be keen to show that he's not just a mobile checkbook and a rich man's son, but a serious racing driver. Max Mosley reminded everyone just recently that Niki Lauda started out as a pay driver too. Nobody thinks Diniz is the next Lauda, but the point was made. Jordan Peugeot. A new look for Jordan after a disappointing first year for the Peugeot partnership. While most of the reliability problems that plagued McLaren Peugeot in 1994 had been ironed out, the engine was still down on power, and the unexpected 2-3 result in Canada, placing the team 6th in championship, in all honesty somewhat flattered the car. Eddie Jordan has been running the team on a shoestring ever since he first started 5 years ago, but had a considerable cash injection over the winter. Allegedly, he got $10 million as his end of Eddie Irvine's move to Ferrari, which will help, but more visible is title sponsorship from tobacco brand Benton and Hedges, meaning that the new Jordan 196 has turned out in a rather nice shade of buttercup yellow, certainly a visual improvement on the increasingly bitty livery over the last couple of years. The car itself is substantially revised from last year's model, raised nose, an unusual two-stage side pod intake, a hydraulic roll corrector in the suspension, and exhausts venting upwards rather than downwards, all in pursuit of reducing the 195's twitchy handling and lack of grip, while Peugeot's new Evolution V10, the A12, has looked both reliable and fast in winter testing. The team will go into 1996 with optimism, but also the knowledge that they really need to be doing better. Gianni Morbidelli is providing testing input, but in pre-season it's been Barrichello making waves, beating many of the top drivers. Car number 11, Rubens Barrichello. Rubinho looked out of sorts and anxious for much of 1995, the pressure of being dubbed the new Senna by the Brazilian media adding to the effects of his own grief at the loss of his friend and mentor. It wasn't helped at all by the arrival of Eddie Irvine, who didn't care about any of that stuff, was much louder and brasher and generally much more on Eddie Jordan's wavelength. While Rubens got more points than Eddie, the Ulsterman demolished him in qualifying and left the Brazilian still at Jordan while he got the move to Ferrari that many had thought would go to Barrichello. Martin Brundle will be a completely different prospect as a teammate, at the other end of his career to Irvine, and never a great qualifier but still competitive and hungry, as Olivier Panis found last year. If Rubens' career is to progress in the direction that pretty much everyone believes it should, the first thing he needs to do is beat Brundle. Car number 12, Martin Brundle. 37 years old and entering his 12th season of Formula One with his 9th team, Martin Brundle probably knows deep down that if he is to win a Grand Prix now, it will be through luck and retirements rather than having the best car and beating everyone. But like Gerhard Berger at the same age, he still believes he can win, otherwise he wouldn't be doing this. His stints behind the microphone alongside Murray Walker for the BBC last year went down pretty well, so one imagines that was an option for him, but he decided to continue racing. Like many in the paddock, he's driven for Eddie in the lower leagues, British F3 way back in 1983 when he was scrapping with Senna for the title. Barrichello was just 11 when Martin made his F1 debut, so he certainly has a lot of experience, which is just what the Irish team need right now. Sauber Ford. Like Jordan, Sauber's financial position, rather precarious in 1995, has been improved over the winter with a big new sponsorship deal, in this case the Malaysian state oil firm Petronas, who are just putting the finishing touches to the tallest building in the world, the twin Petronas Towers in Kuala Lumpur, in addition to the energy drink money from Red Bull. Like Ferrari's new car, Leo Ressa's C15 isn't really a looker, finished in a lighter blue with the aqua of Petronas on the sideboards and the Red Bull logo around the nose, But it's completely revised from last year's rather disappointing effort, and Ford have delivered a brand new engine, the JD, though still branded as a Z-Tech R, which is a 72-degree V10 with a claimed output of 670 brake horsepower at 15,800 RPM. But there was also bad news for the team over the winter. Ford told Peter Sauber that in 1997 the new Stewart team would become the Ford Works team, so once again Peter Sauber is looking for a new engine. He'll also be hoping he can keep hold of Heinz-Harald Frentzen, who was strongly rumoured to be moving to Williams, and said that one reason he stayed in Hinwil was because he was excited about the development of the Ford Z-Tech engine. He's joined by Johnny Herbert, cast off by Benetton, and the two are both known as irreverent and fun-loving, so at least the mood in the team should stay high. Herbert and Frentzen have been doing all the pre-season testing, but the team are said to be lining up young Austrian Alexander Wurz for a spin later in the year, in deference to their sponsors. Car number 14, Johnny Herbert. Johnny's reserves of good humour were severely tested during 1995 as what should have been his big break turned into a year of frustration, with him being sidelined and ignored by the team even as he won 2 races for them, more than any other teammate of Michael Schumacher. And under the circumstances, that was quite an achievement. Maybe it's his 2 wins and 4th place in the drivers' table that have given him the number 1 car status over Frentzen, or maybe that doesn't mean anything. Competitively, Sauber is obviously a step down from Benetton, but Johnny will feel he's proved his point, and will be hoping that he feels more valued and happy in Switzerland than at Enston, and that he can show what he can do against the highly rated Frentzen. Car 15, Heinz-Harald Frentzen. Frentzen was another driver who had a frustrating 1995, as he usually qualified the C14 well, only for technical problems or sheer bad luck to prevent him from turning those grid spots into results time and time again. At least he wrung his first podium out of the thing, and it didn't seem much out of left field when the rumours linking him to Williams surfaced. He will find the ebullient Herbert a much more daunting prospect as a teammate than the injury-hit Wendlinger or the 2 Green Bouillon that he dominated last year, and how he deals with that may well decide his future career. Footwork hard. Ever since Wataru Ohashi pulled the Footwork money out of the Arrows team at the end of 1993, Jackie Oliver has been searching for a new sponsor. The only reason the team are still calling their cars Footwork is so they don't count as a new constructor and lose all their benefits. This year's model is the FA17, a simple evolution of last year's car, which had its moments, with the Hart V8 in the back. In all honesty, Brian Hart's motor has been a bit underpowered in the past. This is a new version which is smaller and lighter, but it probably won't transform it into a winner. Not that anyone is expecting them to win. For Jackie Oliver and team co-owner Alan Rees, the objective is to put enough decent results together to attract a sponsor or a buyer. Jackie and Alan were 2 of the original founders of Arrows back in 1978 and must be getting tired of constantly scrabbling around for scraps at the back of the grid. In charge of getting those results are 2 drivers who are held to be talented, but are primarily in the car thanks to finance. Jos Verstappen brings the biggest name, Dutch electronic giant Philips, but Ricardo Rosset brings Brazilian bank Banespa after finishing runner-up in last year's F3000 Championship. Car number 16, Ricardo Rosset. The successful Rosset textile firm, specialising in lingerie and swimwear, was founded in 1939 in Sao Paulo by Ricardo's grandfather, so the lad was never short of cash growing up, but came to karting relatively late at the age of 21 in 1989 and 90, before moving up to Brazilian Formula Ford, taking 3 wins but only managing 5th overall. But like all South American would-be racing drivers, the siren calling of Europe was too strong, and in 1992 he drove for Peter Thompson in the Formula Opel Euro Series. His first year wasn't great, 17th with 14 points compared to his new teammate Verstappen's 7th with 50 points. But veteran Aussie Alan Docking saw something in him and brought him into British F3 for 1993. With Kelvin Burt and Oliver Gavin dominating the series, Rosset struggled to make an impact, but he picked up a couple of third places to end up just a point behind his compatriot Gualter Salas, second in the Opel Euro Series in 1992. A move to AJS Racing for 1994 saw Rosset take his first F3 win in a Grand Slam at Snetterton and 4 podiums in a row at the end of the season, but in a series dominated by Jan Magnussen he again struggled to impress and ended up 5th overall, a point behind Dario Franchitti. A decent showing in Macau, 8th, and he was looking for an F3000 drive. The Anglo-Japanese Supernova team took a punt, pairing Rosset with Italian Vincenzo Sospiri. Rosset won his debut F3000 race, putting him in the same company as Johnny Herbert, Martin Donnelly and Alessandro Zanardi, but he only won once more, while Sospiri took 3 wins to take the comfortable title win. But it was Ricciardo who scored a race berth, while Vincenzo got a testing role. Now he just has to prove he's worth it. Car number 17, Jos Verstappen. Another driver who's never really been able to fulfil his true potential. After his 1994 Benetton debut, in which he did well enough after being chucked in the deep end, but not well enough to keep the drive, he was loaned out to Simtech. He was clearly elevating the S195 and got some decent times out of it before the money ran out. He did some testing for both Benetton and Ligier at the end of 1994 to keep his eye in, but in a move which baffled many insiders, Flavio Briatore evidently considered him a busted flush and let his contract run out, and he was a free agent. His manager, dealmaker extraordinaire Hugh Brothengatter, managed to broker the deal with Arrows, who must feel they've landed on their feet, and if Jos the boss can do for the FA17 what he did for last year's Simtech, there's still a chance for the venerable Arrows team. Tyrrell Yamaha. The 1995 023 chassis turned out to be something of a technological dead end, with its innovative suspension that just didn't work, though they haven't entirely abandoned the infamous Hydrolink idea and are still working on a new version for 1996. In the meantime, Messrs Postlethwaite and Gascoigne have come up with something a bit more conservative, though returning to the high-nose concept that the team pioneered 6 years ago. In the back is a new engine from Yamaha, the OX11A, and the Japanese firm have come a long way since they were something of a laughing-stock in the late 80s and early 90s. This one is a 72-degree V10, which is running through a new in-house longitudinal gearbox made with new ultra-rigid materials. At the wheel is last year's combination, Mika Salo and Ukyo Katayama, but conspicuous by its absence is Finnish mobile phone brand Nokia, who have evidently changed their minds about sponsoring F1. Instead, there are rather smaller stickers for Motorola, so the chief sources of income come with Katayama, Mild 7 and Korean Air, though British computer company Morse have also upped their backing. They will hope that they can return to the promising form of 1993-4 after a disappointing year. Frenchman Emmanuel Collard is test driver, but probably won't see much cockpit time given the budget. Car number 18, Ukyo Katayama. The little Japanese driver is entering his 5th season of F1, 4 of them with Tyrrell, and after putting in some very good drives in 1994, last year was a bit of a disappointment, and Ukyo became notorious for his off-track excursions. We know now what we didn't know then, that he was in constant back pain from his cancer, which can't have helped, but since he has kept that secret even from his team, he'll be judged by his results on track, and they haven't been there of late. He'll be hoping to turn things around in 1995, re-establish himself in the team, and get back to being surprisingly good for a pay driver. Car number 19, Mika Salo. After being at the centre of a contract dispute over last winter, Salo was probably better off at Tyrrell than he would have been at Pacific, but he's widely believed to be much better than either team would allow him to demonstrate. He did as much as you could reasonably expect. He dominated Katayama in qualifying and only failed to finish when the car broke, and he came close to scoring several times before finally breaking his point stuck in Italy, and then scored twice more in the last couple of races. In a way, it was slightly surprising that he hadn't been snapped up by a bigger team, but there just aren't as many seats going these days. Maybe for next year, if he does as well as everyone thinks he can. Minardi Ford. The little Italian team have always had a hand-to-mouth existence, so it's nothing new that Giancarlo Minardi has had to make do and mend. Designer Aldo Costa has moved over to Ferrari, so a trio of engineers have been working on an update of last year's car. The M195 was designed in a hurry after the team lost the Mugen engine deal at the last minute, and there's little reason to suspect that the M195B will prove a revelation, especially with the slightly asthmatic Ford ED V8 providing power. Pedro Lamy bought his way into the team during 1995 and did well enough, so although it's his Portuguese backing that's kept him in the car, he could be a decent option. Safety car botherer Taki Inoue had signed up in the second car, bringing funding from vending machine company Unimat, but the deal fell through at the last minute. Until someone else with deeper pockets comes along, the team have promoted test driver Giancarlo Fisichella. After 2 years of not much success, the partnership with Scuderia Italia has also been dissolved, so the team are once again simply Minardi in the entry list, though most people outside the team had forgotten about Beppe Lucchini's lot altogether anyway. Car 20, Pedro Lamy. Lamy was highly rated and quickly became a superstar in Portugal, only for his career to nearly be ended before it had begun with a colossal crash testing a Lotus in 1994. He was in the frame for Tyrrell last year before losing out to Micasalo, but was able to buy into Minardi mid-season, replacing the long-serving Pierluigi Martini. He scored his first point, the team's only point all year, in Australia, and out-qualified Luca Badoer 5-3, so while it's difficult to compare, he seems not to have suffered any lasting effects from his accident. Certainly, Giancarlo Minardi will be hoping that he can continue a good run of form, but as ever, he'll only keep the seat unless someone with more money comes along. Car number 21, Giancarlo Fisichella. The noble house of Fisichella have been important in Catania for centuries. Francesco Fisichella was the city's ambassador to the Spanish court in the 1670s. In the early 20th century, 2 cadet branches of the line appeared, one of which relocated to Rome, and it was from this branch that young Giancarlo was born in 1973. He made his karting debut at the age of just 8, and by 14 had racked up 35 wins in the national category and regularly competed in European and international events, placing second in Europe in 1989 and 1991. For 1992 he moved up to Formula 3, driving a Dallara Opel for RC Motorsport, and stayed with them for 3 years, finishing runner-up in his second year before taking the 1994 title, as well as winning the Monaco F3 race and the first leg of the Macau Grand Prix before crashing out in the second leg. He was clearly an up-and-coming star, and a usual next step for him would be Formula 3000, but instead he was offered a testing contract by Minardi and a berth in the Alfa Romeo second squad in the DTM. A respectable 15th overall and 10th in the simultaneous International Touring Car Series underlined his credentials, while getting some F1 experience in the Minardi, though the testing budget wasn't enough to get many kilometres in. When the little Faenza team suddenly found themselves in need of a stopgap driver after the Taki Inoue deal fell through, he got the chance to make his debut in Australia, but he may still be too young and inexperienced to make the most of it. Forti Ford. After a very trying first season in F1, with Martin Brundle quipping that the reason they were called Forties is that you seem to lap them 40 times during a race, the team then suffered a financial catastrophe when Pedro Diniz, who'd been their major beneficiary, departed with his Parmalat millions for Ligier. Development work on the car came to a screeching halt, and the team will take to the track in Melbourne with an amended version of last year's, but Guido Forti had already signed a contract for the expensive customer Ford ECA engine, branded as E-Tech R, used last year by Sauber, with a new Hewland semi-automatic gearbox. With Diniz and Parmalat gone, so was the Brazilian connection, and with it Roberto Moreno, and instead there are 2 Italians at the wheel, Andrea Montemini from Pacific and Luca Badoer from Minardi. The team's objective is as simple as it seems unattainable: survive and qualify for races. The 107% rule is widely regarded as having been introduced primarily thanks to Forti's pace, or rather lack of it, last year, and certainly the closest they came last year was 112%, so it's going to be an uphill struggle. Ex-Ligier man Frank Lagorce has been nominated as a test driver, but he won't be holding his breath waiting to get in the car. Car number 22, Luca Badoer. Back in 1993, when he made his F1 debut in the dying Scuderia Italia team, Luca Badoer looked like a future, well, if not star, then at least a driver with a bright future. But that Lola was not the car to show it, and then he lost out when they merged with Minardi and spent a year testing, and when he came back to take the race drive when Michele Alboreto retired, again last year's Minardi wasn't exactly a great showcase for talent. With Marlboro Italia transferring their backing to Giancarlo Fisichella, Badoer's move to Forti looks rather like it might be the last move of an otherwise promising career. Car number 23, Andrea Montemini. You certainly can't fault Monty's persistence and determination as he joins his third back-of-the-grid team in 3 years. Stepping into the Simtech in the wake of the death of Roland Ratzenberger took a certain amount of balls, and then he had a big smash in qualifying and broke both feet. For him to then gather himself and try again with Pacific was more than many would have managed, and he did pretty well, all things considered. He beat the more experienced Gachot 6-5 in qualifying, and was head and shoulders above Messrs Ligier and Delatraz, and managed to finish of 8th in Germany despite a gearbox failure late on. Like Berger, this does seem to be last chance saloon for the diminutive Italian. At just 5'1", 157 centimetres tall, he still holds the record as the shortest F1 driver of all time, especially as he's now 31 years old. And that's everyone. A rather light grid this year, but hopefully there'll be some great racing to make up for it. I'll see you all in Melbourne in a week's time.